Hey, this is Ramon, Channels Alpha 4, and welcome to chapter 12 of Genesis. What is the rundown? What's the recap? So, in this chapter, you have Abram's call. God calls him away from his family, and you even have kind of a pre Abrahamic call with his father being called out of Ur. Then you have the first journey in migration, which kind of like sets up what's going to happen to the Israelites later. And then you have Abram and Sarah and Sarai in Egypt. So that's the recap. So let's get into it. First off, what you got to remember here is that Sarah is barren. That's important because the promise that gets Abram to even do this is that he will have descendants. So he's on a journey for descendants. And I'm not going to get into the current commentary on this because the current commentary is that the whole late bloomer thing. I don't have any comment on that. I've never even considered that. I will say, good news for any of us that has ever had a hard time getting started. There's always hope to begin. But let's continue on. The chapter itself I love. I love the chapter, but I don't love the interpretation here. And let me tell you why. This is the first chapter where the Christian understanding distorts the original intent of the text. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when the Hebrews either wrote this story or recorded the story, or however you want to say it, told the story at the campsite, it had an original meaning and an original intent. But later Christian writings start changing what this story means, and it just keep from here on out. The rest of the Old Testament, not just Genesis, changes its meaning with the Christian understanding. You're not going to understand the original intent of a text if you're going based off the final book in a series, especially when that final book in that series is written by a different author. It doesn't work that way, okay? Now, for instance, you watch a film, and you've heard this all the time. There's like 4 or 5 sequels. You get to the last sequel and someone doesn't like the last sequel and they're like, well, now the whole series is ruined for me. Or someone does a reboot and they don't like the reboots. Now they're like, well, now the original series isn't any good anymore. People have that kind of mindset. Here's a different mindset though, which is, oh, I love the ending. I love this conclusion. Let me go back and reinterpret the beginning through this lens, which is fine. I am not denying that later works can't change the interpretation of the original work. That can happen with anything. There's an original Hebrewic idea, and that idea is clouded or lost when you're looking through it through a Christian lens. So for me, I like to try to look through it through original intent. Now, this is not a problem that just happens with interpretation. This also happens with translation. So if you want to see a really good example of that, go to Acts 3:25, verse 25, and Galatians 3, verse 8, and you'll see it change what this chapter means to you after you read those passages. Just be aware. Read it first. Okay, read chapter 12 first. Come up with a conclusion. Try to apply that conclusion to your life. Then read Acts chapter 3, verse 25, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. And then come back and then reread it. And you're going to get a completely different meaning. That's important because this also happens with the whole book. For those who are not Orthodox, and you might not know this terminology, logos. Okay? In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Word. So when you put that back in, it changes the entire story. So to understand the original intent, you got to first look at it at how the original writers had it. Then afterwards, for personal edification, you can go back and apply the change of meaning. But first, let's look at it the way that the original writer intended it to be understood. Okay? To me, the original intent of this chapter, before the Christian understanding comes into it, is that it is meant to be an answer to the events and themes of the previous chapter. So you have the scattering of the nations. Well, in there, things kind of seem hopeless. Abram is hope. Hope has returned in the form of a great man who will inspire nations, who other nations will look up to. Okay? And his descendants will be blessings upon other nations. Speaking of original intent, let's get a little controversial now. Then we get to the locations, and I'm going to use the word foreign names here. The names aren't foreign, obviously, but I'm saying names that are not connected to the culture that we're talking about. The names and places given here, specifically the foreign names, as I've designated, are significant to understanding the pre-Hebrew, let's call them Semitic pastoral nomads, that are the genetic ancestors of the Israelites. And what you do is that you'll get an understanding that these trees, that these places, these trees are trees of power, places of power. Okay? And these are also locations and names of oracles. So you have oracles, places of power, and magical trees. So this is a pre-Judaic religion of tree worshippers. Then they leave. So they're leaving this pagan ideology of tree worship. And who's leaving? Well, you have Terah, Abram, Nahor, Haran, Lot, Sarai, Milcah, and Iscah. I'm probably not pronouncing any of that right. Notice that they are marrying cousins, nieces, and nephews. Okay? So already, from our point of view, this is already kind of like, ugh. All right. Then we get to Egypt. And Abram starts calling his wife Sarai his sister. And Pharaoh takes Sarai. Now, here's my question. Is Abram's deception here a sin? I'm not trying to judge Abram. From my point of view, this is a mistake. This is not the right move. You don't call your wife your sister and let the Pharaoh take her. In my opinion, okay? Now, there's one more thing to note here. This story and its themes will be repeated in later chapters with different characters. Some people won't like me calling them characters, but I mean, we're talking about a narrative here. Then let's talk about camels. Camels, you say? What's so interesting about camels? Well, if you take this story literally, there are no camels here during the time of the story. Uh-oh. We got a problem. No, we don't. Don't take the story literal. That's my answer. But let's back up. Camels here are not anachronism. Now, I know what you're saying. How can that be? They didn't exist at that time, domesticated in this area. Well, it's really simple. Just change the time period that you think this story is happening. There is no dates in the story. So the only dates are the dates your brain is applying to the story. Just move it up. Move it up a little. Okay? Depending on when this happens, you have camels. So camels show up around 1000 BC. Between 1000 BC and 700 BC is when this story had moved from the oral record to the written record for the first time. It's just that simple of an explanation. When there are camels is the same time that this story goes from an oral tradition to a written tradition. Simple answer. But let's take it a little bit more literal. So let's say you want to date this story to an historical event. Well, the only historical event that's happened that fits this narrative is the Bronze Age collapse of Babylon. So, just like every culture has a Bronze Age collapse, Babylon's happens during its sacking by the Hittites in 1595. So in 1595, you have Terah leaving with his family to get away. But not necessarily. You can have it even happen a little bit later and have the generations happen. And then, because things haven't gotten better, or because Hammurabi comes up with this code, Terah leaves Ur. It's that simple. Okay? Not a big deal at all. But let's say that's too early an event for you. What's the other event? Well, we can tie it back into Sargon, Nimrod. Now remember, I'm saying Sargon is Nimrod. There's a later guy who a lot of people say is the guy. I don't think so. I think it's Sargon. To me, Sargon fits perfectly for Nimrod. And that dates us to 2284. Now, what's the problem there? 2284, camels are not domesticated. But wait. Let me ask this question. And this is just a very simple question. So what? Okay. So, is it possible before dogs were domesticated that a person and a dog got along and helped each other out tangentially? Yes. Is it possible before cows were domesticated that humans were eating cows? Yes. So is it possible that an undomesticated camel was used by Abram? Sure. It's possible. Does it matter? No. Does that change the story or its meaning? No. In fact, introducing a Christian point of view changes the story way more than taking away a camel at the very end, at the very last sentence. So they chose a camel. Hooray. It's not significant to the story. That just changes the dating of the story from 2000 or 5000 BC. Which anyone dating the story to 5000 BC, you're wrong. Okay, you're just wrong. Sorry, this is not taking place in 5000 or 3000 BC. It's not. But you could easily date it to 1500, to the collapse of Babylon. Anyway, that's the story. Peace.